a city known for its vibrant nightlife, beautiful lakes, and a thriving music scene. Yet hidden beneath the surface of Lady Bird Lake lies a terrifying mystery that has been haunting Austin, Texas for years. Over 16 bodies, one lake, a city gripped by fear. What was once thought of as tragic accidents is now raising chilling questions. Could a killer be stalking Austin's party-filled streets, pushing victims into the waters of Lady Bird Lake and leaving no trace behind? It started quietly enough, a body found on a walking trail. Just another unfortunate drowning, they said. But the pattern grew. Young men disappearing late at night, vanishing without a trace, only to be found days later floating in the very same waters. The circumstances? Strange. The injuries? Unexplained. And every time, the authorities insist it's an accident. But the people of Austin know better. With over a dozen deaths in just the past few years, the truth is becoming impossible to ignore. Something is happening in this city. And it's not just coincidence. In today's episode of Every Town, we're diving deep into a mystery that has everyone asking, is there a serial killer on the loose, or is this simply a tragic pattern of misfortune? The victims keep mounting, the theories keep multiplying, and the residents of Austin are left wondering, who or what is behind these deaths?
Responding to a high-priority call in Zone 300 of Lady Bird Lake around 8:15 Sunday morning. That's near Brazos and East Cesar Chavez Street. A kayaker paddling upstream reported seeing an object in the water. Police, fire, and EMS crews responded to the scene, and AFD was able to retrieve the body from the water. APD says that based on appearance, the body was a homeless woman in her 60s, and that it looks like she was trying to stay warm based on her clothing and the position of her body.
Austin, Texas, a city famous for its thriving music scene, its food trucks, and the glistening waters of Lady Bird Lake. A place where locals and tourists alike flock to the trails, enjoy the nightlife, and take in the beauty of the outdoors. But beneath this picturesque scene, a deadly mystery has been unfolding for over a decade. And it's one that has the entire city on edge. Over the last 16 years, more than 16 bodies have been found in Lady Bird Lake. Some were accidental drownings, the authorities claimed. But for those who have followed the unsettling pattern of these deaths, there's something much darker lurking beneath the surface. This is no mere coincidence. The victims, young men in their 20s and 30s, most of whom were last seen in the bustling Rainy Street district, a popular nightlife area filled with bars, food trucks, and crowds spilling out into the early morning hours. Their disappearances often happen without warning, and then, just days later, their bodies are discovered, floating in the very lake they were likely partying beside. For years, the local police have insisted these deaths are tragic accidents. Too much alcohol, too little caution, and the dark, inviting waters of the lake. They point to the dangers of intoxicated revelers stumbling into the water, unaware of the currents that can pull them under. It's a reasonable explanation, at least on the surface. But the growing number of deaths and the strange circumstances surrounding them suggest that something far more sinister may be at play. Some of the bodies were found in parts of the lake that didn't match the direction of the current, leading to the eerie conclusion that the victims didn't fall in by accident, but were perhaps placed there. Some had signs of physical trauma, injuries that couldn't easily be explained by a simple fall into the water. The question became, could this be the work of a killer? It wasn't until the story of Ray Hammett in 2008 that the pattern truly began to form. Ray, a 55-year-old Lebanese-American schoolteacher and peace activist, vanished one night after a mysterious phone call. Days later, his body was discovered floating near Lady Bird Lake. The condition of his body was so disturbing, his hands and feet bound with duct tape, his body mutilated, that it raised immediate suspicion. The authorities, however, dismissed it as a case of self-inflicted bindings, a ruling that sparked outrage and confusion. Hammed's death was strange enough to make people wonder, was he the first victim of something larger? And if so, what was happening to these men who were turning up dead in the lake? Were they simply victims of the city's wild party culture, or was there something darker happening in Austin's nightlife scene? As the years passed, more bodies began to turn up, each death more puzzling than the last. In 2012, the body of a missing university student, Alina Valette, was found in Lady Bird Lake. In 2014, a young man named Iron Rupke was discovered in the same waters. His death officially ruled an accidental drowning. But questions lingered. How had he ended up in the water in the first place? And then there was Julio Santos III, a 22-year-old man whose body was discovered just hours after he disappeared from a food truck at 2:30 a.m. His belongings were found near a bar, and the case was dismissed as another drowning. Yet his sister didn't buy the official explanation. She believed her brother had been drugged and then thrown into the lake. Was this really just another accident? Or was someone deliberately targeting these young men? The more bodies that turned up in Lady Bird Lake, the more the people of Austin began to question what was really happening. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. There were similarities in the cases. Victims disappearing after drinking, victims found far from their last known locations, victims showing signs of trauma. And then there was the most disturbing pattern of all, the proximity to Rainey Street. This was the heart of Austin's nightlife, where the partying never seemed to stop. Was it possible that a killer was waiting, lurking in the shadows of the nightlife scene? In the face of mounting concerns, the Austin Police Department maintained its stance that the deaths were unrelated and the result of alcohol and bad choices, but the public wasn't convinced. And then, in 2019, the mystery took a new turn. Christian Pugh, a 21-year-old man, survived an encounter that nearly killed him, and his story would change everything. Pugh had been out with friends in the Rainey Street area when he vanished. 2 days later, he was found barely alive, his body showing signs of severe trauma, including broken ribs and a dislocated leg. He claimed he had been attacked and thrown off the Congress Avenue Bridge into the water below. He thought he had been targeted, drugged, and left for dead. But the police, despite the disturbing injuries and the clear signs of a struggle, insisted that it was simply an accident, another man stumbling into the water while intoxicated. Pugh's survival sparked a firestorm of questions. Was there a killer stalking Austin's party district? Could the people vanishing into the lake really be the victims of something more malicious than accidents? Could there be a serial killer at large, preying on the unwary and the intoxicated? By 2022, the bodies had continued to appear, and the theory of a serial killer began to gain more traction. More than 12 bodies were found in or around Lady Bird Lake in just a few months, raising alarm and fueling rumors of a dangerous predator lurking in the waters. The community was gripped by fear, and the idea of the Rainey Street Killer started to gain ground. What was happening in this vibrant city? Was it the result of its explosive growth and the chaotic mix of newcomers and revelers, or was there something far darker at play? And why, despite the mounting evidence, were the authorities so quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play? The mystery of Lady Bird Lake was only growing deeper. Lady Bird Lake wasn't always called that. In fact, before 1960, it was simply known as Town Lake, and it was created for a very different purpose. Originally constructed as a cooling pond for a power plant, it served a utilitarian function, something far removed from the serene spot it has become today. The body of water stretches through downtown Austin, reaching depths of up to 18 feet, providing a picturesque setting for the city's vibrant outdoor lifestyle. But its beauty masks a dark history, one that is just beginning to be understood. In 2007, the lake was renamed in honor of Lady Bird Johnson, the former First Lady, who had worked to beautify its shores during her husband's presidency. The change from Town Lake to Lady Bird Lake was meant to celebrate the area's natural beauty and its place in the heart of the city. Today, the lake is a central feature of Austin's outdoor recreation scene, surrounded by parks, trails, and some of the city's most popular entertainment districts. It's an idyllic setting for joggers, cyclists, and pedestrians. Locals and tourists alike flock to the Anne and Roy Butler hike and bike trail, which circles the lake's perimeter, offering stunning views of downtown Austin and the water. But for all its charm, there's a darker side to Lady Bird Lake. The lake is surrounded by popular bars, restaurants, and clubs, particularly around Rainey Street, an area once home to humble, quirky buildings that have now been transformed into some of the most trendy hotspots in Austin. This nightlife district is bustling with activity, especially late at night, when bars spill out into the streets and revelers pour in from the nearby venues. Despite its vibrant surroundings, Lady Bird Lake has some powerful and dangerous currents beneath its seemingly calm surface. The waters can be tricky, deceptive, particularly around the trails where many of the victims had been last seen. It's not surprising that the lake has been the scene of occasional drownings, particularly during the summer months when the temperature soars. Swimmers, drawn by the heat, often ignore the city's official ban on swimming in the lake, thinking the waters are inviting and refreshing. Yet, over the years, many of these deaths have been ruled as tragic drownings, with alcohol often cited as a contributing factor. The authorities are quick to write them off as accidents, something that happens when intoxicated people end up in the water. The dangers of alcohol mixed with the allure of the lake are easy to dismiss as simply the result of poor decisions until the next body is discovered. But in 2008, something changed. Ray Hamad, a 55-year-old Lebanese-American schoolteacher and peace activist, became the first victim whose death raised more than just questions about drowning. Hamad had been well known in Austin, having lived in the city for more than 3 decades. He was an educator, a philanthropist, and someone deeply involved in social causes, particularly working with the Palestine Children's Welfare Fund, a charity he ran to support families in need. But in February 2008, things took a dark turn. The FBI and IRS raided Hamad's South Austin home, seizing material related to his charity work as part of an investigation into alleged wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. No charges were ever filed, but the raid cast a shadow over Hamad's life. His activities were scrutinized, his political connections were questioned, and he became embroiled in a high-profile investigation that seemed to be linked to his work. Yet none of this prepared anyone for what would happen next. On the night of April 14, 2008, Hamad was reported missing after his last known contact, a peculiar phone call to a colleague in California. The conversation was odd, with Hamad briefing her about the FBI raid and repeating information he had already shared in earlier emails before abruptly ending the call. The very next day, police tracked Hamad's phone to a parking lot near South Lakeshore Boulevard, but after searching the area, there was no sign of him. The case grew stranger with each passing hour. Then, just 2 days later, Hamad's body was discovered floating in Lady Bird Lake, near the I-35 bridge. His body was found in a disturbing condition. Both his hands and legs were bound with duct tape, and his eyes were wrapped in tape, as if someone had deliberately staged his appearance. The authorities insisted it was self-inflicted, that Hamad had bound himself and entered the water voluntarily. Yet many questioned how someone could bind themselves in such a way, especially when the tape appeared to have been wrapped around his head and his body was positioned in a strange, unnatural way. This puzzling death raised more than just questions about the circumstances. It triggered a series of unsettling realizations about the pattern of deaths that would follow. How could a man like Hamad, who was known for his peaceful activism, end up in such a violent and unexplained situation? The investigation into Hamad's death was filled with controversy and confusion. The condition of his body was so extreme that it sparked outrage within the Islamic community in Austin. The imam at the Islamic Center of Greater Austin, Ibrahim Dramali, who had been involved in preparing bodies for burial for over 20 years, described Hamad's corpse as being in an unnatural and barbaric state, with blood and flesh that appeared to have been torn apart. His colleagues were so disturbed by the condition of the body that they had to leave the room in distress. This gruesome discovery ignited speculation about Hamad's political connections and possible enemies. Was this death a message? Was it a targeted attack? Could he have been caught in something much darker than a simple drowning? While the Austin Police Department closed the case as an accidental death, the theories surrounding Hamad's demise only grew. Was Hamad the first victim of something far more sinister? As the years went by, more bodies began to surface in Lady Bird Lake, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. The similarities between the cases began to mount: young men vanishing in the same areas, their bodies found under suspicious circumstances, often showing signs of trauma. What had begun as one bizarre death was now looking more and more like the beginning of a larger, ongoing mystery. And so, the mystery of Lady Bird Lake deepened. Each death raised more questions than answers, and the authorities remained tight-lipped. But for the residents of Austin, one thing became clear. Something was happening on the shores of Lady Bird Lake, and the city was no longer the same. The death of Ray Hammett in 2008 set a disturbing precedent, but it was also just the beginning of what would become an increasingly eerie and tragic string of events at Lady Bird Lake. While Hammett's death initially raised suspicion, the authorities closed his case as an accidental drowning. However, the strange circumstances of his death left lingering doubts in the minds of many, and it wasn't long before another body was discovered this time, far too decomposed for immediate identification. Just a few months later, in June 2008, a local fisherman made a grisly discovery. Early on a Sunday morning, the fisherman had been out on the lake, fishing as he did most weekends, when something unusual caught his eye. At first, he wasn't sure if it was just a floating object or something more ominous. But as he drew closer to the area between the Holiday Inn and Interstate 35, he realized the truth. There, floating in the murky waters, was the badly decomposed body of a woman. Natsima Habibul, a mother and preschool teacher, had been missing for days after telling her fiancé that she was heading to the grocery store. She was last seen alive near the area, and yet, no one could explain how she had ended up in Lady Bird Lake. The condition of her body made it almost impossible to determine the exact cause of death. Her body was so badly decomposed that authorities struggled to identify her at first. A full forensic investigation was conducted, but as with the case of Ray Hammett, there were far more questions than answers. Nadzima's case stood out not just because of the horrific discovery, but because of a critical detail. She was one of the few female victims in a string of deaths that had mostly involved young men. Her death seemed to fall outside the larger pattern that had begun to emerge. But even so, her tragic fate couldn't be ignored. The fact that she was found in the lake, under similarly strange circumstances, only deepened the mystery that was growing in the heart of Austin. For years, there were no answers. The case went cold, with few clues to go on and no suspects. As time passed, the residents of Austin began to notice something that would become too hard to overlook. This wasn't just a series of isolated drownings. Something was wrong with the way these deaths were being handled. Something sinister was at play. 4 years passed after Natsima's death, but the next victim would only serve to confirm the growing sense that these deaths were no accidents. In February of 2012, Elena Valle, a 20-year-old college student, was reported missing after a night out. Her friends had last seen her leaving a bar, and when she didn't return after several days, they began to worry. Her case was treated like a typical missing persons report, but as the days dragged on, anxiety turned into fear. On February 7/12, after a week of searching, the authorities received a call at 8:42 a.m. about a body found in Lady Bird Lake. The scene was grim. Elena's body was found near the intersection of Lavaca and Cesar Chavez streets, not far from where she had been last seen. While her cause of death was ruled as accidental, there were whispers among her family and friends that something didn't add up. The fact that she was found so close to where she had disappeared suggested that her fate might not have been as accidental as it seemed. In fact, her case raised more questions than it answered. But it wasn't just Elena's death that seemed suspicious. There was a pattern starting to take shape. A series of young men were reported missing under similar circumstances, late-night disappearances after leaving the bars around Rainy Street, only to be found days later in the water. Their bodies showed signs of being in the lake for days, and yet authorities maintained that they had just fallen in after drinking too much. In 2014, the case of Iron Rupk, a 25-year-old man, would continue to unravel the mystery. Rupk's last known location was documented. He had taken a rideshare to the Holiday Inn, but what happened after that was anyone's guess. Around 2:30 a.m., the Uber driver dropped him off, and by 2:30 p.m. the next day, 2 fishermen found his body in the lake. Authorities immediately ruled the death an accidental drowning, though it made little sense. How had Rupp ended up in the water? He had been dropped off at a hotel and was seen in the area, but there was no clear reason for him to wander into the lake. What had caused him to end up in the murky water, far from any clear access points, at a time when the lake was empty? Like the others before him, Rupp's case was quickly dismissed as an unfortunate accident. However, family members and friends were left in shock. Was this just another person making a bad decision after drinking? Or was something far more insidious at play here? Then, in 2015, the mysterious death of 22-year-old Julio Santos III seemed to further confirm the fears of the growing number of Austinites who were beginning to put the pieces together. Santos, who had just graduated and was home for a week before starting a new job in Seattle, disappeared late one night after visiting a food truck near a popular bar on Rainy Street. The next morning, his body was found floating in the lake. His belongings, including cash and his ID, were found behind the bar, suggesting robbery wasn't the motive. His sister, after hearing the official explanation that Julio had simply drunk too much and drowned, refused to accept the ruling. "I think he was drugged. I think he was overserved. I think he was lured over to the river and hurt," she said. Her suspicions sparked a new wave of concern among the people of Austin, who were beginning to question the string of deaths around Lady Bird Lake. The authorities, however, continued to insist the deaths were nothing more than accidents. But the mounting number of victims, each with similar circumstances, suggested that something far more calculated was going on. Something that had been quietly growing under the surface of Austin's nightlife for years. The bodies continued to surface. And with every death, the people of Austin grew more fearful that they were dealing with something that wasn't just an unfortunate string of drownings, but the work of a predator. Could a killer be stalking the bars and waterways of Austin? And if so, how many more would have to die before the truth was finally uncovered? As the years passed, the deaths at Lady Bird Lake kept piling up, each one leaving more unanswered questions than the last. But it was the discovery of Christian Pugh's body in 2019 that finally forced the people of Austin to confront the terrifying possibility that something was terribly wrong. The authorities continued to insist that these deaths were just accidents, isolated cases, and nothing more. But Pugh's story was different. It was a survival story that would shake the city to its core. Christian Pugh, a 21-year-old college student, had gone out for what was supposed to be just another night on the town with his friends. The group of young revelers had ventured to Rainy Street, a hub of Austin's nightlife, where bars and restaurants line the streets and the party spills out onto the sidewalk. For many, it was just another evening of drinking, socializing, and enjoying the lively atmosphere. But Pugh, like so many others before him, would never return home that night. His friends lost track of him at some point during the evening. They had no idea where he went or when he had left the group. Hours passed, and as the search for him began, the hours turned into days. His disappearance was a mystery, and the anxiety around it grew as his friends and family desperately searched for answers. 2 days after Pugh was last seen, he was found barely alive. He was discovered south of Lady Bird Lake near the Congress Avenue Bridge, tangled in brush, embedded between the water's edge and the nearby trail. His body was battered, bruised, and covered in extensive injuries. He had broken ribs, a dislocated leg, and bloodied knuckles. His head had a large welt, and it was clear that he had been in some kind of violent altercation. His condition was so severe that he was immediately placed in a coma to help with his recovery. What made this case even more chilling was the fact that Pugh had been conscious when he was found, but his memory of the events leading up to his fall was completely wiped out. When he finally emerged from his coma after weeks of treatment, he had only fragments of memories, but one thing stood out. He believed he had been attacked. He thought he had been assaulted, drugged, and then thrown over the Congress Avenue Bridge into the water. At first, the police didn't believe Pugh's story. They were quick to label it as another accident, suggesting that he had simply stumbled and fallen from the bridge, much like the other victims who had been found in the lake. But Pugh's injuries didn't match that narrative. His battered body showed signs of a violent struggle, not the typical effects of someone falling from a bridge after a night of drinking. Despite Pugh's clear trauma, the authorities continued to dismiss his claims. They chalked it up to the confusion caused by his memory loss and the disorienting effects of being intoxicated. But for Pugh, it was hard to believe that what had happened to him could have been a mere accident. His experience was something that simply didn't fit the official narrative. Pugh's story sparked a new wave of speculation. Was he the victim of a violent attack? Was he pushed into the water deliberately, as he suspected? Or was this just another unfortunate misstep, just like the others who had drowned? But there was one thing that couldn't be ignored. Christian Pugh had survived, and he was now able to tell his side of the story, something that none of the previous victims could do. In the wake of Pugh's harrowing tale, the residents of Austin began to voice their growing concerns. A petition was launched, demanding that the Austin Police Department take a closer look at the deaths at Lady Bird Lake. Hundreds of concerned citizens signed it, and the theory of a possible serial killer began to gain traction. With each new discovery, each body pulled from the lake, more and more people started to wonder if there was something more sinister at play. Could these deaths truly all be the result of bad luck and poor choices, or was there someone deliberately targeting these young men? But as the deaths continued to pile up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that something far darker was happening. The timeline of these deaths became hard to ignore. From 2008 to 2019, there were numerous cases, each one eerily similar to the next. Young men were disappearing late at night after leaving the bars around Rainey Street, only to be found days later, their bodies floating in the lake. Many of them had been drinking, yes. But the pattern of injuries, the location of their bodies, and the lack of solid explanations from authorities left too many unanswered questions. Even more troubling was the growing number of bodies found in or near the lake in 2022 and 2023. Victims who seemed to be added to the mounting toll of mysterious drownings. Ricky Parks was discovered near 9 East Avenue in July of 2022, but his case was quickly closed without further investigation. Then, in December 2022, an unidentified body was found near South Pleasant Valley Road and South Lakeshore Boulevard. Just 2 weeks later, another body was discovered on Christmas Day near the pedestrian bridge along South Lamar, followed by Kyle Thornton's body found near the Congress Avenue Bridge just days later. 3 bodies found in less than 3 weeks. Was this a coincidence, or was there a predator out there, moving undetected through the city? The more bodies that turned up, the more the theory of a serial killer seemed to gain legitimacy. Despite the growing fears and mounting evidence, the police refused to officially link the deaths together. They continued to dismiss the idea of a serial killer and insisted that the deaths were accidents. Tragic, yes, but ultimately the result of poor choices and dangerous circumstances. But for the residents of Austin, that explanation no longer seemed to hold water. Something more sinister was at play. The idea of a Rainey Street killer had taken root in the community's collective consciousness, and the public's calls for action grew louder. In 2023, the bodies continued to appear. The most devastating case came in February 2023, when Jason John, a 30-year-old man who had recently moved to Austin from New York City, was found dead in Lady Bird Lake after disappearing during a night out. He had been enjoying the city's food truck scene before heading toward the Annan Roy Butler hike and bike trail, a path that had now become tragically familiar. His body was discovered 8 days later. His autopsy was ruled as an accidental drowning, but the suspicious frequency of these cases left many wondering if there was more to the story. Then, in March of 2023, tragedy struck again with the discovery of Clifton Axel, a 40-year-old man found dead in the lake. Axel had been on track to graduate from Harvard Extension School and had been involved in his church. He was found near the 1000 block of West Cesar Chavez Street, his death labeled as undetermined, a ruling that was met with frustration from his family, who knew that there had to be more to his death than a simple accident. With each new body that appeared in Lady Bird Lake, the mystery only deepened. Were these just random, isolated drownings? Or was there someone out there, targeting victims in the darkness of the night and slipping away unnoticed. By now, the residents of Austin were no longer dismissing these tragic drownings as just accidents. What had once seemed like a series of random, unfortunate events now appeared to be something much darker. The deaths kept coming, and with each new case, the pattern became more undeniable. In 2022 alone, more than a dozen bodies were found in or around Lady Bird Lake, and the frequency of these discoveries seemed to be escalating. The first major clue that something might be terribly wrong came in July 2022 with the discovery of Ricky Parks's body near 9 East Avenue. His case was quickly closed with little investigation. The authorities, as usual, pointed to alcohol as the likely cause of death. They suggested that Ricky had probably been drinking and somehow fell into the water. The case was ruled an accidental drowning. But for the people of Austin, this ruling raised more questions than it answered. Was it possible that these deaths were all linked to the same pattern? The city had grown rapidly in recent years, and the nightlife scene had exploded. As the city's population swelled, so did the crowd of young partygoers spilling into bars and clubs, only to head to the lake at the end of the night. Was there something in the culture of Austin, something in its fast-paced, alcohol-soaked nightlife, that made it so deadly? Or was there something more sinister afoot? Just a few weeks later, another tragedy unfolded. In December 2022, an unidentified body was found near South Pleasant Valley Road and South Lakeshore Boulevard. The body was so decomposed that it was initially impossible to determine the identity. The authorities made no immediate connection to the previous deaths. But just 2 weeks later, on Christmas Day 2022, another body was discovered near the pedestrian bridge along South Lamar. 3 days after that, the body of Kyle Thornton, a 25-year-old man, was found near the Congress Avenue Bridge. This marked 3 bodies in less than 3 weeks, a disturbing pattern that only fueled the growing suspicions among the public. The term Rainy Street Killer began to circulate in hushed conversations around town. People started to wonder, was there a serial killer on the loose, preying on the late-night revelers who wandered too close to the water? Was there someone watching the crowds, waiting for an opportunity to strike, then dragging their victims into the lake to disappear without a trace? Despite the mounting evidence, the police continued to resist the idea of a serial killer. They argued that the deaths were the result of intoxicated individuals stumbling into the water after a night of drinking. And yet, with every new body, the explanation began to sound less convincing. How could so many people, seemingly healthy and fully engaged in their lives, all meet such suspicious, violent ends? How could so many deaths occur in such a confined area, especially with the strange lack of any concrete answers from law enforcement? By early 2023, things had only gotten worse. Jason John, a 30-year-old man who had recently moved to Austin from New York City during the pandemic, became yet another victim. Jason had come to Austin looking for new opportunities and a fresh start. He had been out enjoying the city's vibrant food truck scene before heading toward the Ann and Roy Butler hike and bike trail, the same area where many of the previous victims had last been seen. He was last seen walking from Rainy Street toward the trail. But after that, he vanished. 8 days later, his body was found in Lady Bird Lake. His autopsy was ruled as an accidental drowning, but the official cause of death only raised more suspicions. How had Jason ended up in the water? Had he slipped and fallen, or had something far more sinister occurred? Jason's family and friends were frustrated with the lack of answers. They couldn't believe that his death had been a simple accident. Could there be a connection to the growing number of deaths around the lake? The community's growing unease was only compounded when, just a month later, another tragedy struck. Clifton Axel, a 40-year-old man who had been on track to graduate from Harvard Extension School, was found dead in Lady Bird Lake on March 5, 2023. Axel had been known for his intellect, creativity, and his commitment to his church. He was described by friends and family as a beautiful, bright ball of energy, someone who brought light to everyone around him. But now his family was left grieving, with no clear explanation for his death. The case of Axel's death was particularly troubling. The medical examiner was unable to determine a clear cause of death, leaving the circumstances shrouded in mystery. Initially, it was explained as an undetermined event, with the possibility that Axel had entered the water on his own or fallen in by accident. But the lack of answers only deepened the mystery. The string of deaths that continued to plague Ladybird Lake was starting to feel like a ticking time bomb. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and the Rainy Street Killer theory was gaining more traction. The authorities, however, were still sticking to their official line. These were all tragic accidents. But the public had grown skeptical. How many more bodies would it take before the police acknowledged that something far more dangerous was happening? As June 2023 rolled around, the body of another man, Mogul, was discovered near the 1000 block of West Cesar Chavez Street. The authorities quickly closed the case, ruling it a non-homicide death. However, by this point, the similarities between the cases had become too apparent to ignore. The victims were predominantly young men, many of them found in the same parts of the lake. Most of the bodies appeared far from where the victims had last been seen, leading many to believe that these deaths were far from accidental. The idea that a serial killer was targeting young men along Rainy Street was becoming impossible to dismiss. Yet despite the mounting evidence and public outcry, the police continued to maintain their stance that these deaths were the result of accidents and alcohol. The absence of concrete evidence linking these deaths together was their justification for not investigating further. But for the people of Austin, this official narrative just didn't add up anymore. One of the most chilling cases was Jeff Jones, another survivor of Ladybird Lake, who had narrowly escaped the killer's grasp. Jones had been visiting Austin for a bachelor party and had been out drinking with friends on West 6th Street. After the night out, Jones had found himself under the 6th Street Bridge, where he was discovered severely injured. He had sustained multiple broken vertebrae, a punctured spleen, and internal bleeding. The medical tests revealed that Jones had been drugged, with rohypnol found in his system. Jones believed he had been drugged and pushed off the bridge, much like the others who had disappeared into the lake. But his case was largely ignored, despite the compelling evidence that he was the victim of foul play. This only further solidified the growing belief among the people of Austin that a killer was using the lake as his personal dumping ground, dragging victims into the water after drugging them and making them disappear without a trace. The most recent discovery came in February 2024, when yet another body was found in Ladybird Lake. This time, it was an older homeless woman in her 60s, found near Brazos and East Cesar Chavez Streets. Police quickly labeled the cause of death as natural causes, but the case was another chilling reminder of the growing number of bodies piling up in the lake. With over 16 victims and no real answers, people were left wondering just how long this would go on before the authorities took serious action. The mystery surrounding Ladybird Lake was far from over. As long as the police insisted these deaths were just accidents, the fear and suspicion would continue to spread. The people of Austin knew that something had to change, and soon. As the bodies continued to surface and the theories about what was happening at Ladybird Lake became more complex, the people of Austin were left grappling with two seemingly opposing possibilities. Could the deaths be the result of simple accidents, or was there something much darker happening in the heart of the city? The police and authorities had offered their explanations, but as more victims were discovered, the public began to demand answers, and the truth seemed to be slipping further and further away. One explanation, perhaps the most logical to some, was that Austin had simply grown too fast, and with it, the danger lurking within its vibrant but chaotic nightlife. Austin's population had surged over the years, with a large influx of newcomers flocking to the city, drawn by the booming tech industry, the promise of a new life, and the allure of Texas's relaxed living standards. Between 2022 and 2024 alone, 52,000 new residents arrived, with more than 46,000 additional people expected to move in each year. The city was transforming, and with that transformation came a shift in its culture. Once a haven for artists, musicians, and a laid-back counterculture, Austin's landscape now boasted luxury high-rises, corporate tech campuses, and upscale restaurants, replacing many of the old venues and gathering spots that had helped define the city's weird reputation. The once hip district around Lady Bird Lake, now surrounded by bars, clubs, and expensive condos, had become a mecca for young people looking to have a good time. Rainey Street had transformed into one of the busiest nightlife districts in the city, full of bars, food trucks, and live music that could keep patrons partying into the early morning hours. The combination of alcohol, young people, and the lake's unpredictable waters was a recipe for disaster. But the sheer number of drownings, the similarities between the deaths, and the ongoing mystery made it impossible to brush away the possibility that there might be something more sinister lurking behind these deaths. Could a killer be targeting these young men, waiting for them to leave the safety of the crowded bars and wandering into the darkness? This theory, the second and much darker explanation, gained more traction as the deaths mounted. A growing number of people were starting to believe that there was a predator stalking Austin's nightlife, taking advantage of the city's bustling streets, crowded bars, and the lake's access points to carry out his crimes. The presence of alcohol in the system of many of the victims, the lack of clear explanations for how they ended up in the water, and the suspicious trauma found on some of the bodies suggested that these deaths weren't the result of simple misfortune. Instead, it pointed to a deliberate, calculated effort to target vulnerable young men. And what better place to commit such crimes than Lady Bird Lake? The lake is an easily accessible body of water, surrounded by popular nightlife spots, dimly lit walking trails, and isolated areas where anyone could disappear without anyone noticing. The area around Rainey Street, packed with revelers stumbling out of bars in the early hours of the morning, was a perfect hunting ground for a killer. The lake's edge was accessible through poorly lit areas, with multiple access points that made it easy for someone to be pulled into the water and disappear. The lake became the perfect place for a predator to act undetected. What made this theory even more compelling were the disturbing details found in several of the cases. For one, many of the bodies had been discovered far from where the victims were last seen, often on the opposite side of the lake, far away from where they've logically ended up. The current of the water ran in the opposite direction, leading investigators and the public alike to question whether the victims had been placed in the water deliberately. Then there were the physical injuries. Some victims had blunt force trauma to the head, while others showed signs of having been drugged before being thrown into the water. In particular, cases like Jeff Jones's, who had been drugged with rohypnol before being dumped into the lake, made it seem likely that a killer was intentionally incapacitating his victims and then disposing of them in the lake. Pugh's case, in which he had survived an attack and recalled being thrown over the bridge after being drugged, added further weight to this theory. The evidence pointed to something far more deliberate than a random string of accidents. It suggested the possibility of a serial killer, someone who knew the area, who could blend into the crowd and prey on people without raising suspicion. These weren't just random drownings. They were murders, and the killer was using the lake as his personal killing ground. While the police denied this theory, insisting that alcohol and poor decisions were to blame for the deaths, the victims' families and the public weren't so easily convinced. As the bodies continued to appear, the rumors of a serial killer only gained momentum. More and more people began to question whether the authorities were intentionally turning a blind eye to the mounting evidence of foul play, possibly because of the city's booming tourist industry. Could it be that Austin's officials were reluctant to acknowledge the presence of a serial killer in their midst, fearing the damage it might do to the city's image? Some of the victims had been partying in the same bars and restaurants near Lady Bird Lake, often stumbling out in the late hours of the night, making them easy targets for anyone with malicious intent. Others had no known ties to the area, yet still ended up in the lake, suggesting a more strategic approach. Could the killer have been staking out these locations, choosing his victims carefully, and using the cover of night and the lake's proximity to the nightlife to strike undetected? There was also the theory that the city's rapid growth, with an influx of tech workers, students, and newcomers, had created a perfect storm of factors that could make it easier for a killer to blend in. As Austin rapidly expanded, many of its new residents had little knowledge of the local environment, especially in areas like Lady Bird Lake. This lack of familiarity made it easier for a predator to exploit their vulnerability. But there was still another layer to the puzzle. The lake's history of serving as the site of drownings, whether accidental or not. It had been a place for tragic deaths long before the string of recent cases. It was, in many ways, a dangerous area to be around, particularly late at night after drinking. And yet, with so many bodies found, and with the injuries on several of them, it was becoming impossible to ignore the possibility that some of these deaths were not accidental. One thing was certain. Something was deeply wrong at Lady Bird Lake, and the residents of Austin were growing increasingly restless. They wanted answers, they wanted justice, and most of all, they wanted their city to feel safe again. The lake, once a symbol of the city's natural beauty and peaceful lifestyle, had become a place of mystery, fear, and death. For many, it had lost its charm. No longer was it just a place for runners, bikers, and tourists to enjoy. It had become a place of uncertainty, where every ripple in the water could signal another life lost. As the bodies kept appearing and the theories kept swirling, the question remained, who or what was responsible for these deaths? The mystery was far from solved, and the fear in Austin only seemed to grow with each passing day. As we continue to search for answers, one thing remains painfully clear. The mystery surrounding the deaths at Lady Bird Lake is far from over. The deaths, the theories, and the unanswered questions are piling up, and with each new discovery, the fear and suspicion only grow stronger. Was it a series of tragic accidents, or is there a dark force lurking in the shadows, preying on the unsuspecting, leaving no trace but the bodies in the water? The answers might be buried beneath the surface. But for now, the people of Austin are left wondering, is the truth out there? And will it ever be revealed? What do you think is really happening at Lady Bird Lake? Are these deaths the work of a killer, or is something else at play? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on this chilling case and others like it. Because the truth, however dark it may be, might just be waiting for us to find it. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some mysteries never stay buried for long.